Okay, good evening. Continuing the story of my stay in graduate school at the University of Kansas, where I earned my master's degree in early 1968. Um, we'll go back to this, just a basic picture from the campus of Strong Hall. The rest of the other 3 semesters that I would spend there academically were relatively uneventful. I did start writing a thesis, which was called Minimax Rational Function Approximation, which I completed with the help of a professor in numerical analysis, and there's some of it, and it's online. I can give the location in my, in the description. Um, and it took about a year to do this, and just on my typewriter. That's basically all I had then. It seems like it's a little hard to. So I did gradually make other friends. I had a different roommate in the fall from the first one. He was a freshman. He was very brilliant, and we got along pretty good together. And then then he roomed with another friend, and I had someone from the Muslim world for a while, and then I made a really good friend within the sort of the Ayn Rand community. A lot of us were reading Ayn Rand, and there was a discussion group about the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which I would eventually read when I was in the Army, particularly Atlas Shrugged. But his name was Rick, and he's from a city in western Kansas called Tribune. And that started becoming interesting. I started writing around with him more and so forth to various places. There was a television station that he worked at, or a radio station nearby, and so forth. So life sort of sometimes got interesting, even though I didn't have my own car and spent most of my time on campus. I remember going to see Dr. Zhivago in downtown Kansas City on a bitterly cold night in December. I remember that. But also, we took a couple trips. Myself and several other graduate students rented a car in transit. I don't know if you can even do this anymore, from Kansas City, and we drove it to Longview, Washington. But we were able to go through Colorado, including the highest passes. That was before the Eisenhower Tunnel, however, that Stephen King liked so much. And I remember Utah, and I remember being the person driving through Nevada and driving Donner Pass. There wasn't really very much snow, but I remember driving through Donner Pass and into California at 3 in the morning when it was my turn into California. And we stayed with friends in I think in Mountain View in Silicon Valley. And then we went on into San Francisco, and I just got one picture from a trip there in 2018. That's Market Street in San Francisco. And then that was December, and then we actually went up to Vancouver. They returned the car to Washington State, to Longview, but I actually flew home to Washington from Vancouver to Seattle to Chicago and to Washington. It was quite an event, and I was feeling fairly confident then, but I was working as a computer programmer for the physics department. And so I was earning money a different way as a programmer, learning more Fortran and so forth. And I had the summer job at Nav Cossack, where I had a secret clearance, and that'll get interesting. There was an occasion when when people from the Peace Corps came in to interview me in the dorm about the roommate I had the first semester. And unfortunately, I sort of snitched. This roommate had bragged about committing crimes in Kansas City against queers. And I kept my mouth shut. I had learned my lesson, I said, at William and Mary, and just dealt with that for one semester and didn't really, but I passed that along to them. So I may have ruined his, I don't know. That was in the spring of '67. Then in the latter part then in the summer of 1967, in August, when I was back home in Virginia, I took a third draft physical, this one in Richmond again. And this physical, I wound up being 1A, and ready for induction. And so I had the deferment. Then I had the 2S, regular 2S deferment until I got my master's degree. And it started getting interesting at the end of the semester. I actually, I also had talked to some Army recruiters about what would happen and what were the chances of getting a good MOS if I had the degree, and would I really run the risk of getting infantry. And I talked to one in Kansas, and I talked to one in Arlington, Virginia. The one in Arlington was more grim. He said, if you really want to be safe, you need to volunteer. So what I did is I volunteered for 2 years, went RA for 2 years, and I actually had an induction date of February the 15th, so I volunteered on the 7th. But that's the next video. But what students put signs on my door that was going to be cannon fodder after I graduated, which was a lot more complimentary than what was put on my door at William and Mary. Now everybody was worried about the draft, and there were student groups opposing it and meetings about it and everything. But I was going to go in the Army at the end. So the last couple of weeks before when I left KU were kind of interesting. We had a kind of a mild spell in the middle of January, a January thaw. I remember that. But on January the 18th, I had my master's orals, and I kind of stumbled through those, and I was glad when my advisor said, well, you passed. But they had a lot of reservations about me, actually. I stumbled over proving Louisville's theorem, a bounded entire function is a constant. Do any of you remember that? They were aware that I was going into the service right after leaving, so I passed, and maybe I got a break. I don't know. It wasn't the best experience. I also had my assistantship back for the entire semester starting in September, so I gave the 4 tests. I remember giving the last hour exam on a snowy day in January, just before, a couple of weeks before finals, right after coming back. I remember that. And so I went from giving exams to being a prole in the Army 3 or 4 weeks later, which I'll start with in the next video. But on January, I think it was during that time, I think in the next couple of days after the 18th, I gave my own exams to my own classes. And I took a bus out to western Kansas in order to meet to spend a little time with Rick, with my friend Rick, who lived in Tribune. I actually rode out there and actually graded the exams on the bus, and spent a day or two in Tribune, and then rode the bus back. And I graded, I remember that on Friday, January the 26th, I think that's the right date, I took the grades over, and about half of the people got a grade of C or better in the course, in the 2 sections, and still there were a lot of F's with a course like that. But this time there were no complaints about my teaching, no complaints. When, previously in the first semester, I was told I didn't have the confidence of my students, and I didn't seem to care about that. This time, nobody seemed to be concerned at all. So it seems like there were maybe, well, I had said some things I shouldn't say, but this time it went, and my exams were probably a little more reasonable, but they were still meaty. So I turned in the grades on the 26th, and literally, took a cab to the bus station and flew home, and was home like that night. And then for how many that would be, less than 2 weeks before I would go down to Richmond to be inducted in the Army. So that was quite a transition, and the next video will show how abrupt indeed the transition in my life, where I went from having power to being very vulnerable to others who have power. And there's kind of a moral story in this. And thank you for listening.